Okay, so if you take a look at this map, you'll see that, of course, the concentration of slavery was in East Texas. So why do I say of course? If I was in class, I would ask you, why do you think it was in East Texas? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Uh, West Texas, North Texas is still the Comancheria at this point. The Comanches by 1860 have not been completely suppressed. That's not going to happen for another couple of decades, and we're going to read about that. So that's one reason. If you look at the map, it's just kind of logical that Anglos are coming into Texas with their captive, with their slaves. Where are they coming in from? They're coming from Louisiana, they're coming from Arkansas, they're coming from Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee through Louisiana. So when Anglos come into Texas, most of them come across the Sabine River, which in 1819 becomes the eastern border of Texas. And that's the way they come into Texas, across from Louisiana. So it makes sense in that way. But also importantly, there is much more rain in East Texas than there is in Central Texas and, of course, West Texas. For every 20 miles you move west in Texas, you lose about an inch of rain every 20, 25 miles or so. Um, and here's the big point. You can't grow cotton west of Austin because there's without irrigation, because there's not enough rain west of Austin. You can grow cotton east of Austin without irrigation because there's enough rainfall. West of Austin, there's not enough rainfall to grow cotton. So the cotton economy kind of stalls out in some respects west of Austin because of the lack of rainfall. Now, there used to be a big argument. There was a historian at UT Austin named Charles Ramsdale. You're not going to be tested on this. He used to argue that slavery would have died out in Texas because you can't grow cotton west of Austin, and the slave economy was based on cotton growth. Well, historians dispute that now. Slaves could have done anything. Slaves could have been cowboys. They could have worked in industry. They could have been laborers. So the idea that just because you can't grow cotton west of Austin means that cotton would have died out, slavery would have died out eventually, no historian really believes that today. But in this period, that is not the case. This period, and I can't stress this enough, cotton production and slavery are intimately tied together. Intimately tied together. Because the Anglos that came into Texas believed that you cannot, and Anglos throughout the South where cotton was being grown, especially in the states of the slave South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. And cotton was grown all over the South, but this becomes the center of cotton production, the Gulf states. They believed to the bottom of their hearts, and I'm not being sympathetic to them, I'm just trying to explain their thinking, that without slavery, you could not have cotton production. Okay, so this was at the forefront of their mind. No slaves, no cotton. Okay, and again, let me stress, I'm not being sympathetic to them. I'm just explaining their mindset, okay? So Texas becomes enmeshed in this bigger cotton economy. Now, this is kind of a big picture intro, but let me give you some specifics and some dates that you're gonna need to know, and you're gonna need to know these for the quizzes and for the midterms. 1803. I've talked about this. Louisiana becomes part of the United States, and suddenly now Texas, Spanish Texas, has a very dangerous new enemy, or very dangerous new neighbor, which would become an enemy, which of course is the United States. Now, I've been thinking about this over the weekend, and I have to say, I think the United States would have grabbed Texas in any event. I don't think there's any way that the US would not have grabbed Texas because the soil in East Texas was very, very rich cotton growing soil. It was some of the best soil in all of North America, in fact. So I, I can't prove this, but I just have this very, very strong sense that the US would have grabbed Texas one way or another. Now, the way it worked out is that Texas broke from Mexico and then 10 years later entered the United States. That's the way it worked out. But one way or another, Texas would have become part of the United States. And Torjit's, he's got this chapter, it's called Bringing Mississippi to Mexico. And one of the ways you might want to think about this period is that the slave economy, the slave society of the Gulf states basically are like a tidal wave that burst into East Texas over the Sabine River. And it was a tidal wave that was not going to be stopped. And I'll just say it one more time because I know you're sick of hearing about it. The reason it's not going to be stopped is there were too few Tejanos in Texas to stop it. At a point where you had, what, 300,000 or 400,000 Americans in 1820 in Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. In Texas, you only had about 5,000 people of Spanish descent, 5,000 Tejanos. It was an unstoppable wave. So the U.S. would have grabbed Texas one way or another. I'm convinced of it. But we're going to talk about how it came to be. So that's 1803. You're going to need to know that. 1819, the Sabine River becomes the border of Texas and Louisiana. 1821, Spanish Texas becomes Mexican Texas. The Spanish are kicked out of North America, and in Mexico becomes Texas becomes a part of the Mexican nation. And one of the things I want you to keep in mind during this period is up until April of 1836, Texas is Mexico. People like Stephen F. Austin, they wanted to make Texas work within Mexico. But their whole thing was that Texas had to be a slaveholding state. And I'm going to develop that as we go on this week as well. So 1821, key date. Of course, 1836, Mexican Texas becomes the Republic of Texas. And then 1845, the Republic of Texas becomes part of the United States. Okay, so there's some key dates that I want you to know. As I said before, the big picture here is this idea of bringing Mississippi to Mexico, bringing U.S. slave society in the Gulf states into Mexican Texas. That's Torjay's big story, that transition. And that's what he traces very carefully in his book. And as you look at the map, what you can see is that Texas is the furthest west of the slave South. So what happens is Texas goes from being a very, very sparsely northeastern portion of Mexico to a bustling portion of the southwestern United States. So there's that's very, very interesting transition. Texas goes from being a northeastern province to a southwestern state. And slavery, the tide of slavery moves into East Texas and especially East Texas. So Texas gets caught up in the global economy. Cotton is the most valuable commodity on earth. You have an explosion of population growth. You have new technologies that allow for the mass production of cotton and clothes and linen and innumerable consumer and industrial items that depended on cotton. England and the northeastern part of the United States, these are productions, these are centers of cotton production. So think about Texas and the Gulf states, think about cotton as oil, and think about how oil is important to the global economy today. think about cotton in the same way in the 1800s, in the period where Texas goes from being Spanish Mexican independent to a U.S. state. So Texas becomes caught up in the global cotton economy. Okay. And don't ever forget, because of that, Texas gets tied up into US slavery as well, because slavery is the labor force for the cotton economy. Now, the last thing I'll say, well, I'll say two more things. At the same time that you have this growth in the cotton economy, that you have this explosion of growth of production of cotton, especially in the Gulf states, including Texas, you also have a growth in the movement for the abolition of slavery, interestingly. So Texas becomes, when Texas becomes an independent nation, it becomes an independent nation right at the time that the abolition movement is developing, especially in Great Britain. So there's this intersection. Texas becomes a slaveholding republic at the exact moment where abolition is becoming a global force. And that's really going to shape Texas history. I'll develop that later, but I just wanted to kind of plant that seed in your mind now. That Texas becomes an independent slaveholding republic and then a U.S. state just at the moment where the abolition of slavery, is becoming a hot topic globally. So Texas fits into global history in that way as well. Finally, why did Spain and Mexico allow Anglos into Texas? You know, it was kind of like letting the fox into the chicken house, that they had no cards to play. Spain and Mexico had no cards to play. They were desperate. They were getting pounded by Indians in the north. Torjay, the first section of Torjay, you read how San Antonio was a mess in 1819, 1820. Texas was just a province that was completely broke, completely bankrupt, ignored by Mexico City. And why Tejanos embraced Anglos and embraced the introduction of slavery into Texas is they wanted a bit of that cotton dollar. They wanted to grab some of that cotton dollar, that they saw that this is their one chance to become wealthy. This is their one chance to become part of this thriving global industry of cotton. So that's why Spain and later Mexico make this enormous mistake and allow Anglos into Texas. But as I said at the beginning of this podcast, it's hard for me to see how Texas would not have become part of the United States. It would have happened in a different way, and the boundaries of Texas might have been very, very different had it happened in a different way. But as a historian, you don't ever want to say something's inevitable, but I just don't see how Texas would not have become part of the U.S., given the geography, given that it was next door to this major slave region and cotton growing region. But what we'll talk about in the course is the way it happened.